guitars. Fellas in suits smoking on cigars. Those little boys making all that noise, but you ain't gon' steal the show. No fancy cars or bass guitars. Fellas in suits smoking on cigars. Just play that song I know. Take a deep breath and blow.
Get loose, get right, get a grip and rock me all night.
Hold tight, lean back, play what I want with that sax.
Get loose, get right, get a grip and rock me all night.
Hold tight, lean back, play what I want with that sax. I need a stand up, but don't with the chains round, so I'm red hot, love but got me freezing. Say you can go on, not the way you lay that check. If you wanna hear me sing, if you wanna hear me sing, if you wanna hear me sing, you better play that sax. Give it to me. You better play that sax. You better play that sax.
Get right, get a grip and rock me all night.
Hold tight, lean back, play what I want. You better play that sax.
Get right, get a grip and rock me all night.
Hold tight, lean back,
Now excuse me if I sound rude, but I love the way that you move, and I see me all over you now. Baby, when I look in your eyes, there's no way that I can disguise all these crazy thoughts in my mind now.
There's something about you.
You got the lock, I got the key. You know the rest, you know just where I wanna be. Don't ever stop controlling me. I kinda like it when you bring me to my knees. You got me wrapped up around your finger. I do anything for your love now. And when you touch it, the feeling lingers. Takes me up so high I can't come down.
You got me wrapped up,
I
man.
don't ever wanna give up. All this spell you got me under. I see fireworks when we touch now.
There's something about you.
Your body fits on mine like a glove. Let them say whatever they want. It's too late 'cause you're in my blood now.
There's something about you.
You got the lock, I got the key. You know the rest, you know just where I wanna be. Don't ever stop controlling me. I kinda like it when you bring me to my knees. You got me wrapped up around your finger. I do anything for your love now. And when you touch it, the feeling lingers. Takes me up so high I can't come down. Girl, you got me wrapped up, oh. You got me so wrapped up, oh. 'Cause there's just something about you, wrapped up, oh. You got me so wrapped up, oh. 'Cause there's just something about you.
Let's go. Okay. My prince is so intelligent, make me wanna reapply to school for the hell of it. I'll be the student, you be the teacher. This sophisticated, such a pleasure to meet you. Yeah, but here's the only issue. Since we met, you gotta turn my world upside down. And I don't really mind Spider-Man kissing you as long as you're planning on sticking around. The happiest boy in the world, the war goes to me. Not a chance, nobody came close to him. I kinda knew you was troublesome. You got me wrapped around your finger like bubblegum.
Everything that you do,
Everything you do.
every way that you move, there's just something about you.
There's just something about you.
Everything that you do, every way that you move, there's just something about you. Girl, you got me wrapped up around your finger. I do anything for your love now. And when you touch it, the feeling lingers. Takes me up so high I can't come down. You got me wrapped up, oh. You got me so wrapped up, oh. 'Cause there's just something about you, wrapped up, oh. You got me so wrapped up, oh.
Wrapped up, man.
There's just something about you.
Shake it like a ladder to the sun. Makes me feel like a madman on the run. Find me, never far gone. So get your leather on. You're a zero. What's your name? No one's gonna ask. You better find out where they want you to go. Try and hit the spot. Get to know it in the dark. Get to know whether you're a crime. Oh, can you climb high? Shake it like a ladder to the sun. Makes me feel like a madman on the run. No, you're never far gone. So get your leather on. You're a zero. What's your name? No one's gonna ask. You better find out where they want you to go.
Short spears and the weekend time I'm on a login. And I war is the good like a riot with only two cups. The more I'm here, I'm making it worse. But does it feel like I'm already dead? Yes. Or do you feel like your brain's stopped delivering? You break my fingers, shoot out my black eyes. It doesn't matter if everyone dies. Hey, look at me, sorry, I'm alone. Hey, look at me, sorry, I'm alone. So fast hands, take an arrow from your quiver over. Past tense was to try about to anyone. I'm out to my death, out to my death. I'm out to my death, out to my death. Yeah. My head reels and I'm crawling down the corridor. I can't see, but I'm heaving like a holocaust. I'm reaching my phone, reaching my phone. I'm reaching my phone, reaching my phone. You wasn't living off and that boy. Your body wasn't the right to. You're running out. I saw some terrible things on that night. I've done a lot of bad things with my life. I put my fingers in there, hey, and I breathe past again. I know they're checking on all of my deeds. I need a checker for all of my deeds. Hey, look at me, sorry, I'm alone. Hey, look at me, sorry, I'm alone. And we be treating me like lost dream. And I'm looking at a hole
We're taught that 1 + 1 = 2. Simple, right? But today's world isn't simple. So what happens if we look at it from a new angle? Could we make something greater? If we bring together human ingenuity, passion, and experience with the latest technology, we start to make something more, building trust for today and tomorrow. Because when a passionate community of solvers comes together, you get new solutions for a new day. That's the new equation.
Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg Live's Deputy Global Editor, Malika Kapoor.
Hello and welcome to Bloomberg Green at COP. Now, many of you are joining us virtually from around the world. Welcome. And those of you in the room, my God, we're so excited to have you here in the room with us because, as you know, it's been a while since we've had a real live in-person audience. So thank you for being with us. Now, over the next 3 days, we're bringing together some of the biggest names and the brightest minds from the worlds of academia, business, and government. And together, we want to really host some solution-based conversations around the goals that are being set out here at COP. We have an amazing lineup over the next 3 days, and I encourage you to look at our agenda. You can find it at bloomberglive.com/green. We have interviews, we have discussions, we even have a film. We are so proud to be screening the Academy and Emmy Award-winning filmmaker Eva Horner's film, Burning, this evening, and I do hope you'll join us for as many events as you can. Before we get started, though, I do have a couple of announcements which will help you make the most of your time with us. If you're joining us virtually and you run into any tech issues, remember you can reach us for support, and you can use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. You can reach us through that. Questions, you will be able to submit questions, and we really encourage you to do so. If you're joining us virtually, you can just click on the white tab on the right corner of your screen and submit your questions through that. And for those of you in the room, it's bgreen.live/ask. And if you need to connect to Wi-Fi, you can connect to BLive, and there's no password. It's really simple. You can do that. Social media, we are really, really active there. The hashtag is Bloomberg Green, so make sure you join us in the conversation on social media. Leave us your comments, share your thoughts, post your pictures. We promise we will engage with you. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our presenting sponsor, PwC. And with that, I'd like to kick things off with a message from Wes Bricker, Vice Chair, US Trust Solutions co-leader at PwC.
I'm Wes Bricker, Vice Chair and co-leader of Trust Solutions at PwC. We all know that trust can take years to earn, and it can be easily lost overnight. In today's world, how a company addresses environmental, social, and governance issues, including climate change, aligned to its own purpose and values, is a key part of building trust with an organization's many stakeholders. We're at an inflection point. Net zero commitments have skyrocketed over the past few years, and this trend is expected to continue. And this is wonderful news for our environment and for communities, but so long as companies continue to see their commitments through. At PwC, within our ESG teams, we say it's time to move from theory to action. And we believe that it takes a holistic approach and a strong overall strategy to determine where an organization is headed and to identify what's needed in reporting, tax planning, operations, and technology that can deliver investment-grade metrics. To move trust forward and to do it well takes all of us, business leaders, board members, investors, regulators, policymakers, employees, consumers, communities, and other stakeholders, all of them relentlessly working together because no one group can go it alone. One thing is for certain, trust is more than just a buzzword. But by building a community focused on doing the right thing and staying attuned to the needs of all stakeholder groups, we can create lasting, sustainable impact. So I hope over the past week or so, and for the next several days, this community continues to learn, grow, share, and get together to drive meaningful change. Because together, we can all work as a community of solvers, uniting to create a transparently brighter future for generations to come. Thank you.
Please welcome Bloomberg Green's Jess Shankelman, Akshat Rati, and Aaron Rutkoff for a conversation with Bloomberg's Senior Executive Editor, John Fryer.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for being here. I know it's very early on the second week of COP, so thank you for this turnout, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in online. I'm excited to launch our 3 days of fantastic Bloomberg Green events here in Glasgow with our What to Watch briefing. I'm talking to three of the leading climate journalists, not just at Bloomberg, but also, and I think, in all of Glasgow. My name is John Fryer. I oversee all of our coverage of business and finance and climate change. I'm going to start with you, Akshat. One of my sort of abiding memories of the first week was you jumping up and down excitedly when Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, announced India's 2070 or net zero plan for 2070. Do you want to give us, and I know that was probably a big highlight of the first week, but do you want to just give us a sense of how you interpreted the first week in COP, and what to you were the big news and maybe some of the disappointments as well?
Well, Modi's speech in particular was very interesting because it started off on a philosophical tone, and I was like, maybe there are no announcements coming, and then suddenly the net zero dropped. And we knew about them having considered it, but there was a lot of resistance from the Indian delegation, as we found out. And so we were surprised that it came through. But I would say yes, I mean, if you start from day one, that would be the day one highlight, that a country that's developing, that has a very low carbon footprint per capita, but also historically is ready to do what is required for climate, which is reach net zero emissions as soon as possible. After that, I think one of the other things that's different about this COP is we've had thematic days, because it's not like Paris, you're not going to get a massive deal at the end of it. And the presidency of COP26 has been trying to put theme days so that countries and companies and organizations can come and set goals. And we got on Finance Day a big, large number under Mark Carney with the Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero, committing to $130 trillion that would go towards net zero. Now, it's a large number, but we don't know yet if all of that capital is going to help the transition and how it's going to help the transition. So a lot of the pledges, I mean, I'm going to talk about are those where they've set these high goals, but we still need to know all the details on how it's going to work out. Another big announcement was the global methane pledge, and that was started off by the US and the EU and now has about 100 countries behind it. And the aim is to cut methane, which is a super warming gas, by about 30% by 2030. And again, it's ambitious, but it doesn't have some of the largest emitters. So India, Russia, China, who are all methane emitters, aren't part of it. We were told from the very beginning when the COP presidency laid out its priorities that coal will be consigned to history, and that was underwhelming. We didn't get much in terms of domestic coal phase out from countries like India and China, but also the US, which is still a large coal consumer. And what we did get was substantial to some extent, where countries like the G20, but including China, said that they will not be financing coal abroad. Now, that brings us to other side deals, which were interesting, but again, remain unclear. So the only other one that I highlight is the deforestation pledge. which is, again, large in that there are 100 countries covering about 85% of all forests. And they say they will halt deforestation by the end of 2030. And there's some money attached to it in the form of $19 billion that can help make that happen.
And what do you say, towards the end of last week, I saw some of these reports. I think the IEA came out with a number. I think the University of Melbourne had a report that said if, and obviously it's a huge big if all of these measures that we saw announced in Glasgow in week 1 were enacted, we would actually hit below 2%. We get into 1.7, 1.8.
Yeah. So these numbers, and one of the things that I think we need to learn to differentiate is all the numbers that get thrown around. So the analysis you're talking about is the analysis that would assume all the pledges that were made will be met, all the net zero pledges for 2050 for US and the EU, 2060 for China, 2070 for India. If all of those are met, then the temperature eventually by 2100 will be about 1.8 degrees Celsius. Now, there's a lot of if in that process. And we quote one number, but it's always a range. And the range is still something between 1.5 and 3 degrees Celsius. So we're not quite out of the red zone, so to speak.
And before I move on to Jess to talk about the week ahead, as a seasoned climate observer, do you come out of the first week more optimistic than you went into it?
I was surprised by how much headline-grabbing announcements there were. COP is about a lot of technical details and a lot of square brackets, and we'll hear a lot about that in this week. But I was surprised by how much. But I mean, it's one of those framing questions where countries have been saying for a long time, we'll do something about this problem. Now they've said, we'll do something by certain date. We'll do this X thing by certain date, and we'll be able to hold them accountable, and I think that's progress.
It's a subtle shift there, isn't it, between saying you should do this and why aren't you said you would do this, and why aren't you doing this?
Yeah.
Jess, let me turn to you. Like Oxshot, you survived week one, so firstly, congratulations for getting this far. You wrote a really interesting piece this morning about what to look at in week two. And you know, traditionally, everyone sort of says week two is where the real business happens, is where the negotiators swing in and really get down to the nitty-gritties. So do you want to maybe kick off by giving us a sense of like what's at stake in week two? What are we trying to achieve here?
Yeah, sure. So as Akshat says, last week was pretty star-studded. We had Joe Biden, Leonardo DiCaprio, everyone was there making big announcements. And you couldn't kind of, it was quite, you know, we had to work quite hard to try and cut through those announcements. And this week is more about the traditional COP negotiations. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons that the UK government has all these side deals that were announced last week is because there is slightly less to negotiate. It's not like Paris where they're trying to negotiate a climate deal. They're trying to finish the rule book on Paris to implement what Paris is. So some of that is, the biggest issue is Article 6, which is carbon trading, and how countries can't agree on how carbon trading should work. It's hugely controversial, and we're going to talk about carbon offsets in the next panel. So the main argument, well, there's three big issues around carbon trading at the moment. One is how to stop double counting. Can
you explain that just a little bit?
Are you sure?
Why don't you run through them first, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty.
Double counting, share of proceeds for adaptation projects, and the third one I'll come back to. Okay, I'll go to old credits. What to do with old credits? Yeah. So I'll start with that one. Before we had Paris, we had the Kyoto Protocol, which developed this clean development mechanism, which wasn't very good. There was all sorts of very bad credits created under that. But some of the countries that have projects under that say, well, what do we do with all these credits that we generated? Can't we transition them over into our next phase under this new carbon market we're going to create? And countries like the EU are saying, no, those are old credits. They weren't very good. Let's look forward and actually implement new projects which will cut emissions. So there's a big row going on about that. Environmental groups, speaking to someone from Carbon Market Watch on Saturday, and they were saying, no, we should have no transition of old credits at all. Mm-hmm. That would be the ideal situation. But they also think that there's so much political pressure to get a deal done that we're likely to end up with them agreeing okay, like a vintage of, it's a bit like wine, like, a vintage of 2016 credits or 2013 credits. But even within that, you say, okay, so if it's a 2016 credit, does that refer to when the project was registered, when it started generating credits? So it's like you could end up with a later date, but an earlier point in the project, which then makes it worse for the planet. So there's going to be a huge amount to unpick there. And then double counting, this comes down to corresponding adjustments. So the idea is that if I sell you a credit, in theory, I should take that off my balance sheet and you add it to yours.
Yeah.
But countries like Brazil are saying, we want to keep it as well as you keep it. So that's
So
how
claim the credit for it as well. For this,
we both claim the credit.
Yeah.
And Brazil says that's what should happen. And everyone else says that doesn't make sense. So, but we've heard that we've been reporting that Brazil have said publicly as well that they are prepared to compromise on this, but there's no compromise until you compromise. So I don't think we're going to see movement on that until maybe Thursday, Friday. At the moment, it's just people signaling. Like, people are always going to get in a room and say they're prepared to compromise until they actually have to make sacrifices. And then the last question is share of proceeds. So today's adaptation day at COP. One of the big issues with climate finance is all the money seems to go into cool solar panels and wind turbines. Nobody wants to build a flood wall because it's not very sexy and you don't get much of a return on investment. So poor countries are saying, here's a clever idea, here's a way to make sure we get adaptation funds. When you do a carbon trade, you siphon off a bit of that money and it will go towards adaptation projects. So that's agreed in one part of the Article 6 negotiations. That's agreed in if we create a global carbon market. But there's also a separate part of Article 6, which is bilateral deals. So like Switzerland to Peru, for example. And they're saying, the US and the EU are saying it's not technically feasible to do that. And I think, to me, it seems like one of the problems is, because of the repeated failure of governments to create a globally regulated carbon market, what we've ended up with is we've got bilateral deals between countries, we've got companies doing offsetting voluntarily. Now they're also trying to create a globally regulated carbon market, and we've got the CDM, and none of them are superseding the other ones. So we're ending up with hodgepodge of different things, and you can't apply the same rules to all of them. So it's a mess, basically.
Well, yes, very well articulated mess. Thank you. What would you say are the best case outcomes and worst case outcomes in terms of, if you wanted a well-functioning carbon market coming out of this?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's no transfer of credits from the CDM into the new globally regulated carbon market that has not yet been created, and also no double counting, but it sounds like another option on the table is to have some kind of transition period where you say, okay, for a couple of years, you don't have to correspondingly adjust. One thing that is interesting on the latest draft of Article 6 text that came out, I think it's Clause 74, says that businesses will also have to correspondingly adjust if they do trades under Article 6, which I think could be quite a big deal for companies, and making sure that like if Shell buys offsets from the US, they have to also correspondingly adjust. So even though they're not in the Paris Agreement officially, they would have to do that. So I think that's going to be quite interesting.
And as a veteran of many COPs to date, COP is famous for running days and days over, and you sort of see these photographs of like journalists sleeping in sleeping bags in the press room, etc.
Yes.
What is your best? You were probably one of them. Do you have a best bet on how this will shake out towards the end of the week? I mean, obviously we don't know what's going to happen, but
yeah. So the UK is briefing that the last 13 COPs didn't finish on time, and they want this one to finish on time because it'll send a signal that the world is really committed to tackling climate change.
And that's Friday, right? That should
be Friday. However, people who come to COP and negotiate at COP, I think it's a point of pride that it doesn't finish on time.
Yes.
So yeah, the last COP I went to was actually a couple of years ago, and what happened was it went over and carried on over in the Friday night, and they thought they were going to get a deal, so they kept going, so it finished at 4 or 5 a.m. For me personally, that would be really bad situations.
Yeah.
I think it's better. So, for example, this Saturday just gone, they were supposed to do an informal stock take, and they just said, look, we're not going to have time. Let's do it on Monday. So I think it would be better if you kind of get to midnight, 1 o'clock, and say, there's so much to do. Let's all go to bed and come back tomorrow, rather than actually making you go through the night. But we are entering the week of all-nighters. There's going to be more and more of these. Even last week, there were things going very, very late, and then people getting up at 3 in the morning and restarting. So I think it's going to be tough. There was one summit many years ago where I think there was a lingerie show, and there was another one where there was a car show following in the venue afterwards.
Yes, that was,
so they were still kind of negotiating as the new conference was setting up. So I think the UK is really, really keen to show that it's organised and it's going to finish on time, but it's already behind schedule. So
right.
I think it's unlikely.
And luckily for everyone here, the Bloomberg Green Daily newsletter will be keeping you all up to date as this weekend
Twice a day.
runs on.
Twice a day.
Twice a day. So please sign up and share it. Aaron Rutkoff. So Aaron is the editor of Bloomberg Green. You came in on Saturday, I think, for the, to save the day in the second week.
Well-rested reinforcements, yeah.
Well-rested reinforcements. So you're based in New York. Can you just tell us a little bit about how COP is being? Obviously we're in this little bubble here. Bubble of sort of climate experts and climate journalists and what have you. But just because everyone here is talking about climate change doesn't mean everyone in the rest of the world is talking about climate change. Can you just tell us a little bit about how COP is being seen and playing in the US media?
I don't think it's invisible in the US context right now, but certainly there's been a lot more attention if you're focused on politics that overlap with COP, on what's been happening with the infrastructure bill in the US and the Build Back Better, which is Joe Biden's social spending and climate initiative. There's been a ton of drama that's coincided with Biden's arrival here, and I feel as if in many ways to a domestic audience in the US, those things were a far bigger, more salient part of what's been happening recently than are the climate politics at COP. And in part that in some ways because the US role here hasn't been as clear-cut. It hasn't had a story of progress like we saw in past COPs, like in the Paris Agreement. I think it's been a little bit more obscure to kind of measure the true contributions of US climate leadership, even though there's been a lot of talk about returning the US to its primary role as one of the drivers of climate leadership in the world.
And for those of us here who've just been focusing on COP in the last week, can you tell us a little bit about where are we on Biden's climate plan, and how likely is that to be enforced, or which parts of it might get enacted?
So what we saw at the end of last week was the passage through both houses of Congress of the infrastructure bill, which is the bipartisan part of the spending plan that has support among Republicans and Democrats. There are some important climate provisions in there. It's primarily a kind of traditional highway, bridges and roads kind of infrastructure bill, which is not seen as very climate friendly, but there are parts of the legislation that will be bringing a lot of money into things like electric vehicle infrastructure in the US. And given that we're coming off of a period where there's been essentially zero legislation to spend money in a positive way on climate change in the US, those things are a big deal. With the Build Back Better legislation, which has much more spending on climate related stuff in a far broader category that's not just about kind of transportation infrastructure, there's still a big question mark hanging over that. There were some very progressive members of Congress who didn't vote for the infrastructure package because they were displeased that it was passed without the Build Back Better part of this. And that's the bill where we've seen it go from a $3 trillion price tag down to $1.5 trillion or something like that. And the politics of Joe Manchin, who's a senator who comes from a coal state, have been very dominant. Nancy Pelosi is coming here now as part of a big delegation of lawmakers from the US. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of remarks they make here at COP in regards to the importance of the Build Back Better legislation, which is just still up in the air. I mean, it's not clear what will happen exactly yet.
And what are you looking forward to personally? I think today is about adaptation. Is that Adaptation Day in COP? Anything there you're particularly interested to see, or even during the rest of the week, apart from staying up until 3 in the morning to edit Akshat and Jess's stories?
Well, I mean, I do think what Jess was speaking about in terms of if Article 6 is solved, creating a mechanism in there that contributes, like rocks in a revenue stream for adaptation spending, that will be really fascinating to see. There hasn't, there is supposed to be this big pool of money that comes from wealthy nations to less developed nations that pays for things both like renewable energy and defensive adaptations. It's been chronically underfunded since, for the decade that it's notionally existed. And so if you're looking at the US role here, I believe it's one of the obstacles to the Article 6 passage is the fact that the US has a position, now joined by Europe, that this kind of transaction fee on carbon trades is a problem. So it'll be interested to see if there's ground that's given there. We have that's kind of one of the patterns that we've seen, unfortunately, while the US has been articulating like raised ambitions that are parts of the global agenda at COP that the US has been on the outs with. Akshat mentioned domestic coal use is something that they didn't phase out, and the politics of coal with Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, a coal state, have been very tender. So it'll be interesting to see if in this place where there's not a domestic political constituency necessarily that is standing in opposition, whether there's more flexibility on the US part to contribute money to adaptation spending.
And just to give some context here, we had new analysis this week where we compared what would happen if net zero goals are met, including China's, including India's, and the US will end up as the largest historical emitter, which it currently is, but even with the next 30 years worth of emissions from other countries, nobody will exceed US's contribution to the problem. And so there is a lot of baggage that the US needs to be addressing, and for all the leadership talk, we haven't seen that kind of commensurate response.
And what are you expecting in the second week? Most looking forward to?
To the square brackets. Yeah. You're going to hear a lot about the square brackets. And so, what are the phrases that negotiators are going to settle down on? We have a list of bullet points that are about getting into the final document about what the parties would like to have agreed upon. Will 1.5 degrees Celsius be a key goal in there? Because that's become now the rallying cry. And if it does, it would be a big deal because it would set the tone for future COPs because they'll have to continue to deliver on the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, which is much harder than the 2 degrees Celsius goal.
And do you think, success or failure of COPs is a very difficult concept because even if you got one successful side deal that had a long tail, that in and of itself would be a win. But do you think Article 6 is sort of the bellwether for this COP, and whether it's perceived, and perceptions do matter after all, whether it's perceived as being a success or a failure?
I think it is. And it's not just Article 6. The rule book has other aspects to it. So there are transparency rules around how countries report both their emissions, but also create standards for reporting their nationally determined contributions, which are these pledges saying how much emissions they're going to cut. It's really hard to compare them today. It's really hard to collate them and tell us where the world is headed. And all those details need to be worked out because as we get into implementation, not having that standard and those rules will really be a hindrance to implementation. So for all our planning about we'll get to 1.8, which is far better than 2.4 or 3 degrees Celsius, that implementation is going to be much harder than what we are facing right now.
I have one final question for the panel, sort of a very general question. As COP is taking place, there's a lot of people in the UK, a lot of politicians in the UK, also in the US, who hear this refrain over and over again that net zero, getting to net zero is going to be too expensive. It's not something that ordinary people are really, it's not something that ordinary people are interested in or that they want to pay. It's going to cost too much. Do we think as a group that the climate movement, the climate advocates are adequately sort of bracing themselves for the fight that seems to be brewing? Some people suggest, another way of framing the question is the climate change movement, the climate adaptation movement, is there a risk that it sort of becomes to be seen as like globalization was? It's an elite, it's a hobby horse for the elite, and it's ultimately something that ordinary people, it's too expensive for ordinary people, it doesn't benefit ordinary people, all of this renewable energy transition. It just seems to be like a narrative that's forming.
I think in the UK, it's like there's like a dormant campaign there ready to pop up again. It's had to do it a couple of times before. And in the UK, there's some Brexiteer Tories who are preparing a campaign for a referendum on net zero, and they're really pushing hard for that. One of the things to remember, there's a report out today from Christian Aid, not specifically about the UK, but it's important to remember they're saying that vulnerable countries are going to lose 64% of their GDP as a result of the impacts of climate change, and I don't see that argument being made enough. People talk about the costs of net zero, but they're far less than actually the costs of what climate change is.
The opportunity cost.
And that counts in the UK as much as in vulnerable countries. We're all, you've seen the US being hit by wildfires and Germany being hit by floods. Like, nobody is immune to the impact.
Right.
There's also, sorry.
Well, if you're going to look at it from a perspective of, is it an elite concern? I think it's only something like a third of our individual emissions are caused by our lives. The rest of it is the infrastructure, the nation that you're connected to. And in many of the countries that are less developed or have been historically much smaller emitters, and so they're much closer to net zero just by living in those countries. So I think it kind of flips that perspective a little bit and shows that, it's more of a concern for people from high emission countries, whereas if you're coming from a place of low emissions, you're much closer to net zero.
And I would just say that, when we were talking about progress, of course we were looking at the past 2 weeks or the lead up to this COP, there has been massive progress since 2018 when the UN published its special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius. We have young people come out on streets. So the public acceptance of climate change has never been higher. We're talking about this Brexiteer group that wants to try and do a net zero referendum. That group was able to gain momentum because there were underlying forces for Brexit in this country. When you do sentiment analysis, and I just saw a report last night, there isn't one against climate change because people understand, at least in this country, how big a problem it is. And so will it have the same momentum even if there are people of the same caliber to have done it in the past? It's unclear right now.
Well, on that note, I'm afraid we need to wrap up. I've been told that I need to keep ruthless time here, so it's always a good idea for the first panel to end on time. So thank you very much to the panel, and thank you for listening, and thank you to the virtual audience for watching as well. And we'll be back in a couple of minutes with Jess, who's going to be talking about offsets. Thanks, everyone.
Hi both, thanks so much for joining us. This is Myles Allen from Oxford University and Mark Kenber. We're going to be talking about the role of offsets. And I'm going to start by asking you, Myles, is there a role for offsets in reaching net zero emissions and 1.5? Because I think lots of people say there isn't at all.
Yeah, well, it's called net zero for a reason, which means we have to recognize we need to stop global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. That's just something that everybody in this COP needs to get their minds around. And that means when we're at net zero, we will be compensating for remaining uses of fossil fuels with something that will look like an offset. Now, whether it's done yourself to get rid of the CO2 internally in your own operations, or whether it's done by paying a third party to get rid of your CO2 for you, the climate doesn't care. That's what net zero means. So that's where we've got to get to. Now, most offset transactions today look nothing like that. And that's where, yes, we've got more to talk about which offset transactions today are actually helping us get to net zero, and which may even be slowing things down. So that's a really important conversation.
Great, okay, and I do want to talk about that. So earlier in the week, last week, I was at an event at COP where Mark Carney was talking about the importance of offsets, scaling up offsets, and he was protested by Greta Thunberg and Jennifer Morgan from Greenpeace, and they were holding up signs saying this is a scam and it's greenwash. Are they right to do that? I think that their argument is that you can't scale up the offset market and have a high quality offset market at the same time. Do you agree with that? Mark, or is Greta wrong?
So no, I was at that event.
Yeah.
I saw and heard what went on. I think the concerns that Greta and the representatives from Greenpeace and ActionAid and many of the indigenous leaders who were there were absolutely well-founded. I mean, we know from the history of voluntary and CDM projects over the last 20 years that there have been projects that haven't respected the rights of indigenous people in local communities, haven't taken into account the needs of those communities, perhaps have overestimated the emission reductions that have taken place. But on the other hand, there have been a lot of very good projects that have driven finance to important development issues, have reduced emissions and avoided it and removed emissions. So I don't think it's sort of binary to say they're good or bad. They can be good if they're rooted in science, if they're above and beyond what corporates should be doing in terms of getting on the path to net zero that Myles mentioned. And we heard last week that the UN Secretary General is setting up a panel to try and define what net zero means for non-state actors. So I think if we're looking at, Myles talks about this path to net zero sometime by mid-century, and companies should get on a science-aligned pathway to do that, but they will still have some remaining emissions. And my view is that if they can be done, and it's an if it can be done well, i.e. it respects, have conservative baselines so the emissions aren't overestimated, they're done not only in partnership but driven by local communities, and they support countries' climate plans, then I think they can be very valuable in driving finance to areas where it's really needed over the next 10 years or so.
And have you seen, you've been to COPs before, have you seen this level of interest in offsets previously, or do you think we're kind of entering a new phase where they're under extra scrutiny?
Well, it comes in waves. I mean, there was a boom in the first decade of this century where many people, I think probably exaggerated, thought the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol might solve all the world's ills. And that clearly was unfounded and over-enthusiastic. And then there was a sort of drop-off. And as you know, in the last couple of years, we've seen that the voluntary carbon markets in particular have started to grow. I think Ecosystem Marketplace said it could be worth over $1 billion for the first time this year. So there's clearly interest. And I think some of that interest is genuine desire to go above and beyond and drive finance, particularly to developing countries, to support their climate action. And there may be others who are thinking this is an escape clause.
So, yeah, go on.
I was going to say, the situation has changed since we were last sort of in this enthusiasm for offsets, and that back in the 2000s, the goal was roughly halving emissions, or maybe, that's what people were talking about. And if that's your goal, then there's plenty of scope for the use of offsets in managing that smaller volume of emissions that you're aiming for. Net zero changes that logic completely, because we're no longer aiming for essentially reducing emissions in rich countries and not really worrying too much about emissions in poor countries, which was kind of the Kyoto model, because the science now makes it very clear we've got to get global carbon dioxide emissions to zero. So as we're heading for net zero, I think the really important thing that the offset market and everybody playing in it needs to recognize is the role of offsets needs to change between now and net zero. And that sort of transition, that transitional role is something I think a lot of people need to grasp, because people are investing against this market, and therefore they're making a statement about what they believe the future will be like. And that statement needs to be, as Mark says, based on science.
So we were talking earlier in the previous panel about Article 6. I want to ask you about that, because that's what the big question is here at the COP. I want to start by asking, as I mentioned in the previous panel, there's a clause in the current draft which says companies have to correspondingly adjust, as well as countries, if they trade under Article 6. So even though companies aren't actually in the Paris Agreement, in that situation, they become subject to the rules of the Paris Agreement. Is that significant?
Well, I think it's recognizing something which is sort of the elephant in the corner in the whole Article 6 discussions, which is that if a company pays a forestation project or something in Brazil for its carbon, and then Brazil counts that carbon towards its NDC, it's double counting. So how are the numbers actually going to add up? And to be honest with you, I don't understand what that clause you've quoted actually means, but it's a recognition that there's an issue here. And I think that's, I think on the plus side, I think we have to recognize that all these really complicated headaches with Article 6 will disappear as we approach net zero.
Right.
So to some extent, I think we have to keep this in perspective. We've taken 97 to present, I can't do the maths, but whatever it is, 20-something years arguing over, offset processes since Kyoto. Now, within the next 23 years, we're going to have to be at net zero or pretty close. So if we're going to argue about offsets for the next 23 years, by the time we finished arguing, it'll be completely irrelevant.
So are we arguing too much? Do you think we should just let them get on with it?
Well, I think there's good to be got out of the, well-designed offset markets today can serve a purpose if they're subject to the safeguards that Mark is describing. But we also have to recognize, and companies need to recognize, where we're going. When we published the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting last year, we really emphasized that if you're actually net zero aligned, your options for offsetting become much smaller as we approach net zero. Because we need net zero, above all, to be durable. There's no point in a net zero that's just an accounting trick that you manage to sort of confect from some cocktail of emissions and removals in a particular year, which unfortunately is, I think, the way a lot of governments are thinking about it. Certainly, the way the UK government seems to be thinking about net zero. If they can manage to balance the books in 2050, they're done. They're happy, and they're really not worrying about what happens after that. No, net zero has to be durable, which means that fossil fuel emissions, which are totally durable, that once you burn fossil fuels, it's out there forever, will have to be balanced by equally durable removals. So that's a very specific kind of offset, which virtually nobody uses at the moment, which is capturing CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it away permanently, either underground or back in some form of rock. Now, what we need the offset market to recognize is we need a transition from where we are now, which is the offset market entirely dominated by either paying for emission reductions or paying for nature-based removals, afforestation type projects, to a situation where the offset market's entirely dominated by something which is completely different from the transactions that we're talking about today, and which is a couple of orders of magnitude, 100 times more expensive. And that's what I think we need companies to recognize. And if in the sort of, I wouldn't mind if Shell was heavily involved in the offset market if they also came out and said, by the way, we've got a transition plan, and by 2050, any fuel which we're still selling, which we're claiming as offset, will be offset by direct air capture and geological storage. And we're going to put the cost of that on the price.
So you're touching on a point I wanted to ask. So if I as a company wanted to offset my emissions, what's the best kind of offset that I could buy? You talked about direct air capture, but there's also a question around how it's stored and how safely it's stored, isn't it? So talk us through it. There's quite a small number of actually very, very high quality offsets on the market at the moment, isn't there?
To be honest, I have a slight problem with this quality of offsets, as if it's sort of just a scale. I mean, different offsets do different things. And I would say I wouldn't want the private sector to, as it were, spend all its money on capturing a very small amount of carbon today. I mean, there's a certain amount of money available for these projects, and companies don't have unlimited pockets. I wouldn't want. Sorry, we've mentioned Shell. Why not?
About Shell, don't
I'm sorry. It's a nice, convenient label. So, well, apologies to any Shell people in the room. It's because also because credit to them, they're taking their responsibility seriously.
We can talk about BP.
We can talk about BP. Well, we can talk about anything. But the point is, a hypothetical company wanting to offset, they're going to have a certain amount of money they can spend on it, or they think their customers will tolerate. Now, devoting all of that money to the most expensive option means you're only offsetting a very limited fraction of your emissions as a result of, you're going for only the gold-plated Rolls-Royce variant. So what makes more sense is a mixture, but put some of your investment into these offsetting options that we know we're going to need in the future so that they can be scaled up, and recognize that transition in your offset portfolio. So, start with, by all means, using the most cost-effective emission reductions, high-quality nature-based solutions that we have available today. There's huge opportunities there. They can be done at, they can be achieved at relatively low cost, which means also high volume. I mean, low cost doesn't necessarily mean lower integrity, it can just mean you get more carbon out of the atmosphere. That's a good thing. You get more carbon for your dollar. But in so doing, you've got to recognize that's not going to last. That we need to transition to air capture, so basically taking CO2 actively back out of the atmosphere. If we're still burning fossil fuels and putting CO2 into the atmosphere, we've got to be taking it back out, and it's got to be being stored away permanently. And we've only got less than 30 years to build that industry, and we need to build that into the way we use offsetting today to ramp that up, to make that transition.
So are you skeptical that some of these technologies are going to be commercialized in time in order to be able to deliver on?
I'm 100% confident they could be, and Mark could probably comment to this, but what at the moment, the offset market doesn't really differentiate. It doesn't really differentiate by permanence. It doesn't differentiate by origin of CO2. Mark's right. That is changing, but we need people playing in this market to recognize the need for that transition, so that they don't just declare we're offsetting X tons, but of the X tons that we're offsetting, this much is going to these permanent, captured out of the atmosphere offsets, which will still work in 50 years' time, regardless of what the rest of the world does, and the rest is going on these high-quality, lower-cost options today.
Well, I think part of the issue here is the balance between investing in technologies so they become more affordable. And so if we only go for cheap, inverted commas, lower quality offsets, then that may or may not be diverting attention from investment at the technology development and deployment and testing level that we need. So I absolutely agree with you about the balance. I think to assume that the offset market or market for voluntary carbon credits is going to drive the decreasing cost for direct air capture, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw with renewables, there was a carbon market, there are carbon markets, the EU emissions trading scheme, and also the clean development mechanism. But the cost decrease in solar and wind was driven by direct government support through feed-in tariffs and mandates. And I think we're going to need the same for geological sequestration, direct air capture. So I think they're part of a bigger picture. And one of the concerns about voluntary use of carbon credits is that it will substitute for the investment and the effort that should be put in decarbonisation.
Yeah.
And so, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, very clear about the fact that this must be in addition to and not a substitute for. So companies should be on their deep decarbonisation pathways. They should be investing, as you say, in the technologies, in the oil or in the fossil fuel sector, the technologies which will allow them to be net zero if they are should be producing and using fossil fuels at all in 30 years' time. But I think there's a carbon market in the short to medium term which allows the investment in protecting nature, in low carbon development. And so I think you're right about this scale of high to low quality. But one thing that's really important is if there is an investment going into, for example, a developing country to support its NDC, that the offset market isn't just hoovering up all the easy to do cheap stuff. And that's why one of the things we've been doing, I think many others too, have been working with countries to say, as part of your NDC, as part of your sorting out the money that you require, that think about carbon markets to go to some of the more difficult things, the bits that you need foreign investment for, because many of the lower cost things governments can do themselves.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about not allowing rich companies to buy all the cheap options now.
How do you not allow them? How do you stop them?
Well, one way is for countries who, often in the voluntary carbon space, have sort of taken a back seat or been sidelined to say, this is what we want the investment for these sectors or for these transformations, to finance the just transition in, for example, our brick-making sector or our palm oil sector or our land use sector, and we will only accept investments in these areas. And this is how the benefit sharing is going to work, and this is how we're going to use the profits, and this is who needs to be involved. And that may put the price up a bit, but it means that the finance and the investment is going to things that the countries and their communities are defining that they need, rather than someone else.
And just to sort of add to that, you could also take sectors that you could argue can perfectly well afford to do things. So take aviation as the classic one, which everybody sort of worries about offsetting. I would, at the moment under Corsia, aviation is, to put it bluntly, sort of hoovering up the cheapest, lowest quality offsets.
Corsia is the aviation, Corsia is the aviation's industry's offsetting.
Yes, and it's entirely based on afforestation type projects and avoided emissions, and all of the, it's absent some technological breakthrough that nobody anticipates at the moment, because aircraft engines last a long time. The aviation industry will still be using fossil fuels in 30 years' time. So, and they should not be trying to claim they can compensate for their use of fossil fuels in 30 years' time by planting trees. You can't turn rocks into trees indefinitely. That just doesn't work. So, the aviation industry needs a plan and a published pathway of how it's going to get from where it is today to every ton of carbon dioxide coming out the back of their jets being recaptured from the atmosphere and disposed of permanently by 2050. And frankly, if the aviation industry showed that plan and showed how they were going to ramp that up, if they want to compensate for the rest of their emissions by afforestation in the meantime, that's great. But what I need to know is that they've got their eyes on the destination.
So this comes into the question of corporate claims, because the thing about the carbon offset market is there's questions about the integrity of the sellers, but also the question of the buyers and what they're doing with that offset. And one of the big questions around corporate claims at the moment, we talked about aviation, I think it's EasyJet say, oh, we've got carbon neutral flights because we're offsetting. Yeah, is that okay? So, because there's a...
Do you want to speak to that?
I will.
There's an argument that you could say, oh, well, we're not using... If I'm right in thinking that we're not using offsets to claim net zero, but we can say we're carbon neutral on the path to net zero. That's right, isn't it?
There are all sorts of claims that many companies make. I've told people this week how I moved house earlier this year, and the removal company, this tiny little local company, said carbon neutral across the bottom. And I asked them what they meant by that. I don't know, mate. We bought some offsets from someone down the pub. That was kind of, it wasn't quite like that, but it was a bit like.
What pub they're going to, yeah.
It was a little bit like that. I'm exaggerating for effect, but you know what I mean. So I think I think, as you know, I'm running the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, which was set up precisely to look at how claims should be defined. And it's partly driven by those companies that are doing the right thing, which is they have committed to a science-based pathway to net zero. That includes making a commitment to more or less halving their emissions over the next 10 years, that that executive pay is linked to succeeding on that they've allocated capital to make the investments that will get them there. So they're really proving that they're on the path. And it's driven by civil society and consumers who want to know, when they see a claim about we're carbon neutral or climate hero or net zero, what does that actually mean? Does it mean anything at all? So one of the things that we've been thinking about is what is the pathway to regulate that? So regulate the claims. For example, we have the Advertising Standards Authority here. They should be able to judge that an advertisement or a claim like the one you mentioned, whether it's true or whether it's misleading. And then if it's misleading, to remove that advertising. We have the sort of fair practice in the European Union, which allows companies to be fined a certain part of their revenues for misrepresenting the public. So I think one of what we're working on is providing a practical but very robust piece of guidance for how companies can make claims, what they need to do both in their decarbonisation and the kind of carbon credits they're using, and then we'll work with governments and regulators to ensure that that is enforced.
And on these claims, one thing which I feel very strongly about, which at the moment I don't think is adequately represented in either the science-based targets or indeed in this whole UNFCCC process, is that you can declare yourself net zero by continuing with business as usual up till 2049 and then shutting up shop. That doesn't make sense. If your business still involves the use of fossil fuels, you need to be decarbonising the fossil fuels themselves, not just saying, I'm going to get a bit smaller or diversify into other areas as part of your strategy. So I think that's one thing which is very badly misunderstood in this whole market at the moment, is that just getting rid of fossil fuel assets by flogging them off to somebody else who probably cares less than you do, that's not delivering a net zero world. We've got to decarbonize the fossil fuels themselves.
Yeah, and that's actually potentially making things worse as well. But that's another conversation to be had. Akshat and I were trying to come up, we wrote a newsletter a couple of months ago, we tried to come up with a term, and obviously this is what you're working on. We came up with carbon responsible. Okay, if you're not carbon neutral, you're carbon responsible. What about you? Have you got any ideas of what a company could call themselves if they are buying offsets, but they don't want to claim that they're carbon neutral or net zero?
Well, I mean, we spent a lot of time arguing about this over the Oxford Principles, and we came up with the phrase net zero aligned offsetting. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I mean, we're academics. But the point of it is that it's the alignment of your strategy with the end goal, and above all, I think we need clarity from companies on that they understand what the end goal is, and that they're not counting on just indefinitely turning rocks into trees. And you know, I think that would really help, because the end goal is not very far away. A lot of companies have set themselves net zero targets before 2050, which means that, you know, they're buying aircraft engines today that they will still be using when they will be in a hard net zero world, or when they envisage being in a hard net zero world. So what are they going to do with what's coming out the back of those engines? I mean, that's what we need to know.
So I think, I mean, you're right. You need to know what the end goal is, but what happens between now and the end goal is also important.
Will also determine how unpleasant the planet will be when we get to the end goal.
Exactly.
So, yeah, absolutely.
How much we can reduce and how much we can remove today, tomorrow, the day after is also very important. But I think that what we call this is very important, but it's got two parts to it. One is it credible? Does it actually have any meaning to it? And second, is it intelligible and understandable to people who are increasing? I mean, I looked at the newspapers over the weekend, and they are all full of full-page adverts saying I'm a climate hero, I'm net zero, I'm carbon neutral, I'm on the road to this or road to the other. And I looked at it and I don't know what they mean. And then some of them had a little bit of explanation saying that some renewable energy that they'd bought had offset something else that they'd done. So. And as a customer or as a sort of general member of the public, I don't know what it means.
Yeah.
And I've been working on climate change for 25 years. So I imagine your average person in the supermarket is already bombarded with claims about fair trade or organic or natural or whatever it may be, is just going to hold their hands up and go, I have no idea what to do. I'm going to buy the cheap stuff, as usual. So I think we need something that feels both understandable and robust. And that's the trick.
Great. All right. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Myles. We've run out of time, but thanks for such an interesting conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm looking forward to understanding all about Article 6 over the next week, and I'll be calling you up to find out what you think.
Tell me if you've understood it.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Unilever CEO Alan Jope in conversation with Bloomberg Green's Akshat Rathi.
Alan, welcome to Bloomberg Green.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, actually, I should say thank you for coming to my hometown of Glasgow.
Oh, and you told me that there were fights you had in this club?
Well, you know, I've been pleased to see the indigenous people represented throughout COP, and it's nice to be one of the indigenous people of Glasgow. Although some of the stories from my childhood probably best not told.
Well, so just a little bit of a background before we start off. Alan heads Unilever, and Unilever is, of course, a giant company with a global footprint. It also ranks on the GlobeScan sustainability ranking #1 for 11 years running. How Unilever has done that is a question that can be answered in many ways, but what do you think has been the key to Unilever's success, and you know, why aren't others catching up?
I would say it's in our DNA. Sustainability and trying to do business in a way that has a positive impact for society and the planet goes all the way back to one of our founders, in fact, many of our founders 100 years ago. My predecessor did a fantastic job of resurrecting that DNA and putting it at the center of our business model. And I must say, we don't define success as topping these rankings at all. It's an outcome of other objectives that we have. And specifically, we believe that putting sustainability at the heart of our company will derive better performance for all of our stakeholders, including, by the way, our shareholders. So it's an outcome, not an objective.
But there's usually an upfront cost. So let's talk through perhaps some examples of the difficulty of being able to cut emissions from a global supply chain. Palm oil is a very good example. Many people probably have heard of palm oil as an ingredient, but haven't realized that they've probably had palm oil this morning in breakfast or in makeup products that have been used. But it's also, it's a very key ingredient, but has a huge impact on deforestation, mostly in Indonesia, but there are other parts. What has Unilever done to be able to address that problem?
Yeah. Well, you started the question about what about the costs of sustainability and then moved into palm oil. Let me deal with both those. We strongly believe that sustainable business has got a powerful business case around growth, around reducing cost, not adding cost, around reducing risk and attracting talent. And we think we've saved about 1.2 billion euros of cost, mainly through avoided energy costs through our commitment to sustainability. Now,
that's 1.2 billion euros over what period?
Over about 10 years, and accelerating, largely because we made an early commitment to going into renewable electricity. So all the electricity we use is now from sustainable sources. Now, palm oil is an interesting material. It is certainly true that there have been horrific examples of deforestation due to the creation of palm plantations. But palm is also a very efficient material, and were we to somehow or other demonize palm oil and say get rid of it, it would cause even more catastrophic effects because the yield from palm oil is about 8 times greater than from equivalent products like soy or rapeseed oil. The key thing now is to make sure there's no more deforestation from palm oil. There's plenty of acreage under cultivation for palm now. And what we're preoccupied with trying to do is make sure that the palm that Unilever sources now is sustainable. That the smallholders and the concessions that we're sourcing from are not engaging in incremental deforestation, are using the minimum required amount of pesticides and fertilizers, are respecting human rights on in their operations. If you take deforestation specifically, I think the only answer we've concluded is technology. We're now at about 98% of our palm is from certifiably sustainably sourced locations, and we audit at scale. But if you're in a palm concession on a Wednesday and everything's tickety-boo, there's no human rights abuses, there's no deforestation, who knows on the Thursday what happens when the auditors have left the facility. So we're in a partnership with Google Earth and massive real-time satellite-based mapping, coupled with, interestingly, tracking of the cell phones on the truck drivers who go to pick up the palm fruit, coupled with some artificial intelligence. And basically what you put the three together and you see if there's a piece of deforestation happening that you can see on the real-time maps, and you can track where the trucks have been to pick up, and you map that, then we can now start to eliminate or work with anyone who's engaged in deforestation.
Right. You talked about risks of climate change. Now, we are, for a long time, the conversation around climate change has been, it's going to affect us in the future, and it'll get bad and very bad very quickly. But it's in the future. Are you starting to see those impacts on your company in any way?
We've talked about this, and I know it was in a way a surprise to you how climate change is not a sometime in the future thing for Unilever. It's a here and now thing. It impacts every single quarterly result that we post. Let me give you some examples. Well, let's start with the general principle, which is a world that's on fire or underwater is not a great place for us to be doing business. We're a very physical company. We lost a lot of sales when the west coast of the United States was on fire last year. In fact, one of the founders of one of our brands, Kate Somerville, it's a makeup brand, a skincare brand, Kate lost her home. Her home was burned down in the forest fires in western United States. Or flooding in China or Europe was very disruptive to the flow of materials that we use. But the easiest example for people to get their heads around is, you'll have noticed that this year was an unusually cold and wet year in continental Europe. If you're in #1 ice cream business in the world and people are not out in the piazzas of Rome enjoying the sunny weather, it has a very immediate effect on sales. So whether it's demand being suppressed or supply chain disruption, every quarter we see some impact from climate change.
We're here at COP, which is mostly about countries meeting together, saying what they're going to do and who's going to pay for what. What's the role of business? And you spent a week now here. What is it that Unilever does, but just generally business community do to help or hinder the progress at COP?
I don't think we hinder too much, but thanks for framing the question that way. So we think that there are 3 sort of existential challenges in the world: climate change, the loss and destruction of nature, and growing inequality. And none of these are good for our business and are all very difficult to solve. So I've been delighted to see the representation of business here in Glasgow. I mean, the number of major financial institutions, banks, companies whose CEOs are present with decent-sized teams doing some hard work. I think it's a positive sign. And let me just explain very simply why. We've discovered this ambition loop between the private sector and government where when business steps up and makes ambitious commitments and shows action, we've found it emboldens government to reach harder on their NDCs, and vice versa. When we know that the government is committed to decarbonising and putting in place the policies to decarbonise, it emboldens us to reach higher. So I think there's a virtuous cycle between business and government, but that's only 2 of many stakeholders. Right. Civil society and NGOs play a critical role. I think it's great that the youngsters are out there calling on the grown-ups to do better. And academia is very important as well, because invention and innovation will be so central to studying and improving the situation.
Well, you say you help, okay, agreed, but businesses can also do that in reverse. So Unilever might rank up here on sustainability rankings, but there is a lot of lobbying that happens from businesses in many parts of the world. America is probably the clearest example of it, where they do try to run the ambition loop in reverse.
Yeah.
How is it that you can try and address? I mean, because that's going to affect your business, as you're saying. If climate is not acted upon, that's going to have an impact on your business. So what is it that you do to push the quote-unquote bad actors?
So I was just going to use that term. So let me not be naive. I think there are good and bad actors in the business community. Frankly, in any community, there'll be good and bad actors. Let me give a short answer, which is we have engaged every trade association that we're involved with. We've analyzed their lobbying position, and any that we think run contrary to our interests and our ambitions around climate change, then we will withdraw. We will not fund industry associations that are associated with bad lobbying. The slightly longer answer, if you want it,
sure.
Is we have a model of change that we use, whether it's tackling gender issues and equality, working on nature or climate change, which we start with our own operations. And we've reduced the carbon footprint of Unilever's operations by 74% since 2008. We're all green electricity, and we've got really good programs. Then we look at our value chain, so our suppliers and our distributors, and we now are working with 56,000 suppliers, but 300 of those suppliers generate 80% of our Scope 3 upstream emissions. And we're going to work with those 300 suppliers, and we're going to preferentially buy from those that are taking action on climate change. So our own operations, our value chain. Then the third is our brands. Actually, our brands are our most powerful lever of influence. And then the final layer is advocacy and lobbying and partnerships and getting involved with government. And we do deal with it in that order. It's not entirely sequential, but it's prioritized. You know, it's hypocritical to be lobbying if you haven't got your own house in order first.
Right. Now, you brought up Scope 3 because that was going to be a follow-up question. You don't have an absolute net zero goal in the sense that you don't cover all Scope 3 emissions. You, of course, you talked about your own operations, which are typically 5% of your emissions, less than 5%?
About that, yeah.
So 95% is Scope 3, of which supply chain emissions you talked about. So your suppliers consuming fossil fuels to be able to produce goods for you. But there's a whole other set that you are not addressing, which is what happens to emissions that are attached to the customer's use of your products?
Yeah.
Why haven't you put that in the goal, and what are you going to do about that?
Yeah, so let me explain a little bit what you mean. So by far the single biggest source of emissions in Unilever's end-to-end value chain is the energy that is used to heat the water to wash your clothes, wash your hair, wash your skin, cook your food. And that is the bit that you're talking about. So we do have a goal for that. So we've said that by 2030, we will have the emissions end-to-end, including full scope consumer use of all of our brands. That's quite an ambitious goal.
Right.
The accounting standard for Scope 3 emissions does not include those. So when we say by 2039, we will be net zero, it excludes that per the accounting standard. However, the only way we can get there is by decarbonizing the grid. I mean, at the end of the day, we've tried to get people to wash in cold water, take shorter showers. My own favorite, shower with a friend, but we can't even get people to do that. And so, yes, we can innovate. We can get laundry products that wash at colder temperatures. It's very hard on personal care to get people to wash with cold water. So in the end, what we require is, or what will work is decarbonization of the grid, and we will continue to lobby for that. In the meantime, we've set a goal of having the full end-to-end Scope 3 emissions by 2030. It's quite a challenge.
Right. No, and I appreciate. I mean, the accounting standards have been. There are rooms to be flexible around those accounting standards, but eventually, I feel like there is a public reputation that is attached because. Customer use may not be included in your Scope 3 per the accounting standards, but look at fossil fuel companies and their customer use is definitely in their Scope 3. And so if they're going to try and address it, then there'll be demand for demand on you eventually to try and get to net zero. 50% is a good start. That's what science says we need by 2030, but I think eventually you're going to need that.
I think you're probably right. You know, we wrote our climate transition action plan, and we were the first company in the world to voluntarily put that to a shareholder vote. So our board was quite anxious about doing this because we thought that there might be a substantial group of shareholders who said you're not going far enough, or a substantial group of shareholders who didn't buy the business case and said, why would we vote for decarbonizing Unilever? So we wrote the plan and put it up to our shareholders for support. And 99.6% of our shareholders approved this climate transition plan. And the only real business case was one day there will be a price on carbon. There has to be. And having less carbon in our end-to-end operations must give us competitive advantage. But we also said that every 3 years we'll update the plan. So we'll report every year, but every 3 years we'll brush up the plan. And when we look at it in 3 years' time, I will certainly have your words ringing in my ears that it's not good enough not to include full end-to-end Scope 3 emissions, but we are where we are.
Now, I poked holes in your plan. There is a really good thing about your plan, which is you don't have a role for offsets, at least inclusive of the Scope 3 until supply chain. Now, tell us why that's the case, and have you talked to other business leaders who rely on offsets?
Yeah. Well, as I said, we've managed to take 74% of the emissions out of our operations, and that is authentically taking them, just being a less carbon intense supply chain. And we think there's miles still to go in that. There will come a point where there'll be that last hard to eliminate set of emissions where I think we will need some kind of high quality, verified, heavily audited offsets. But we believe first we need to get rid of the physical carbon footprint. And many companies come and ask us for advice. Sounds a little arrogant, but for input, including, I hope they wouldn't mind me saying it, but BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, their number 2 guy has been and visited us twice now, and he just wants to understand, how do you go about decarbonizing your business? And that's an instance where, for example, we'll be very clear saying offsets are not good enough. Offsets should be the last thing that you turn to, not the first thing that you turn to.
But in the process of getting to that point, right, offsets are, the panel heard earlier, it's a market that's growing exponentially.
Yeah.
Are there steps you're taking to try and improve the quality of offsets? Because eventually you'll have to use them.
Yeah.
Or are you just waiting because it's going to be a decade out and that work will start to happen any which way?
Yeah. I think the model example we have right now is LEAF. So lowering emissions by accelerating forest finance. And what it's trying to do is match demand and supply. Now, LEAF hate being described as an offsetting mechanism, so, but let me explain how it works. Companies that have got high quality carbon transition plans with goals that are aligned to 1.5 degrees SBTIs, you have to be a high quality company on the demand side who wants to invest in protecting forests. Then the jurisdictions, aka countries, also have to authentically commit to protecting identifiable tracts of land with a high level of verification and auditing. And what LEAF does is it matches high quality demand with high quality supply, with, frankly, entry criteria on both sides. And I think that's a model for future offsetting markets where there will be quality standards for both the buyer and the seller.
Right. Now, you've been here a week in COP. What have been your highlights so far?
Well, first of all, it's nice to come home. I saw my sister, which was nice. A highlight for me is we believe that COP needs to deliver 3 things. Number 1, a higher level of ambition in NDCs, and reading that we're now kind of at about 1.7 degrees when that's a big improvement. So the NDCs that I hope are about to be agreed, I think that's a highlight. Really seeing nature-based solutions on the radar at scale is a highlight. And the third is finance and the growing commitment to a transfer of funds from affluent nations to less affluent nations. There certainly doesn't seem to be a shortage of capital to invest in this space. Another highlight was seeing the passion of Al Gore, just talking to Al and seeing him lit up when I think he finally feels that some traction is within grasp. That was a personal highlight. And just to match the ledger, a low light is the lack of progress on a price on carbon. Ultimately, the highest impact action that I think we can take is to get a price on carbon north of €50 or $50 a ton.
So now the politics of price on carbon are complicated, and different countries do it differently. Here in Europe, even as part of the EU, now not part of the EU, here in the UK, there is a price on carbon for certain sectors of the economy. But are there ways in which you can influence that price on carbon to actually come through?
Yeah, there certainly
everywhere?
Is. Let me give 2 by ways of example. We were very active on the OECD work to get a minimum corporation tax of 15%. So if the global community, political community, can band together to establish a minimum corporation tax, surely we can align on putting a price in place on carbon. Secondly, we can lead by our actions. So, I talked about get our own house in order, then our value chain, then our brands, then our work on partnering and advocacy. Well, we have used an internal price on carbon. It's been fascinating. We originally put it in place to try and differentiate between different capital allocations. So we can build a new plant this way, or we could build a new plant that way, and we put a price on carbon and try and have that as a tipping. So it was 50 euros a ton.
Right.
So about where it needs to be, building towards 100 euros a ton. Actually, it didn't really help us discriminate much between projects. But what it did do, it wasn't a notional tax, it was an actual tax. It's generated, I think, about 120 million euros that we've taxed our capital projects on and used to invest in innovative low-carbon technologies in our manufacturing and our distribution. So it's created an experimental fund for us. It's been fantastic.
Well, I mean, I think people now appreciate, but many companies, the companies of your size, are larger in economic terms than entire countries on the planet. And I'm not talking island nations, I'm talking the 50th largest economy now is you're probably bigger than the 50th largest economy.
I doubt it, but sounds good.
Now we're coming to the close of our time, but just sticking with price on carbon, there is an implicit price on carbon with shareholders demanding companies to cut emissions, to do right by climate. How much has that happened to you as a company, even if you have high rankings? What are your conversations with your shareholders like?
So I'm still consider myself quite a rookie CEO. I've been in the job just over 2 years. But even in that 2.5-year period, the horrible expression ESG discussion with our investors has changed dramatically. So a couple of years ago, literally in investor meeting after investor meeting, there would be 5 minutes at the end where the portfolio manager would go, oh yeah, we're meant to leave 5 minutes to discuss ESG, and turn to a junior colleague in the room and say, you got any questions on ESG? That has really changed, and we'll now have entire 1-hour sessions with investors where the only discussion that they want to get into is what are you doing on carbon? What are you doing on human rights? What are you doing on your supply chain? How do you verify that your supply chain's not doing things that it should be doing? What do you do when you find it is? And so the nature of the conversation is changing, but is sustainability in your business fully priced into how the market thinks right now? 100%, definitely not. Right. So we're in the early waves, I think, of sustainability getting priced in, and we still have to make the business case. If we make the case that sustainable companies grow faster, have lower risk, reduce cost, and are a magnet for the best talent, then I think the market will start to price it in.
Now, you're leaving COP and you're going to watch how things play out in this week from afar. Is there one thing that you're looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose all of us at the end of the day want to make sure that the aggregate commitments of the countries represented here are in line with, or at least closer to, a 1.5 degree future. It will be catastrophic if that's not the case. So that, I think, is the headline outcome that none of us know yet where that's going to come out. Yeah. You were telling me the negotiations always overrun.
They do.
I hope they don't overrun for too long, because the tension's killing us.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Asha.
And we'll talk again. The work that Unilever does is always fascinating to me. We didn't end up touching on things like carbon labeling, which is something.
Carbon labeling. We didn't touch on clean futures. We didn't touch on innovation and the role of innovation. So I'm happy to come back and bore you with some of that at some point.
Wonderful. Great. All right. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Malika.
And That's a wrap for this, our first session. I'd like to say a big thank you to all of you for being with us, and thank you to our virtual audience. A huge thank you to our speakers and our moderators, the Bloomberg Green editorial team. And I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsor, PwC. We'll be back at 5 p.m. this evening for an exclusive screening of Eva Orner's documentary, Burning, and a very exciting announcement about our own and new Bloomberg Green documentary project. So you have to come back at 5 to find out what that's all about. I'll see you then.
To move, so I make it harder. Don't hold back. If you think about it, so many people do be cool and look smarter. Don't hold back. And you shouldn't even care about those noses in the air and the crooked stairs. Don't hold back. Cause there's a party over here, so you might as well be here with the people care. Don't hold back. The world, you're holding back. The time has come to. The world, you're holding back. The time has come to. World, you're holding back. The time has come to. Galvanize. Come on, come on. You may stumble, trip up, fall on your face. Don't hold back. We think it's time you get up. Crunch time, back and sit up, the monkey pace. Don't hold back. Put apprehension of the back burner, let it sit. Don't even get it lit. Don't hold back. Get involved with the jam, don't be a prick. Hot chick, be a pig. Don't hold back.